The rifle kicked against his shoulder with a mechanical precision that felt wrong to men raised on bolt-action weapons. Private First Class Harold Jensen, 22 years old, from a farm outside Madison, Wisconsin, squeezed the trigger again, and again, and again. 8 shots in rapid succession, the M1 Garand barking its distinctive metallic voice across the frozen Belgian landscape. The date was December 19, 1944. The place was a snow-covered ridgeline 3 miles southeast of the town of Bastogne, and the German soldiers advancing through the pine forest below were learning something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of American infantry firepower. Jensen's squad leader had told him the same thing his instructors had said back at Camp Roberts in California. Don't think, just aim and fire. The rifle does the work. It sounded too simple. Everything about the M1 Garand sounded too simple to the men who first encountered it. No bolt to cycle between shots, no magazine to fumble with in the dark, just a self-loading rifle that fired as fast as you could pull the trigger, 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition loaded from a single disposable clip. The German infantry Jensen was engaging carried Carabiner 98 Kurz rifles, the Kar 98K, the standard bolt-action weapon that had served the German army since 1935. Each shot required the soldier to pull back the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, chamber a new round, close the bolt, and re-aim. A well-trained soldier could manage perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, with adrenaline, cold, and incoming fire, that rate dropped considerably. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Jensen fired his 8 rounds in less than 10 seconds. He thumbed the safety, reached for another en-bloc clip from his bandolier, and loaded it with a practiced motion he had repeated thousands of times in training. The clip slid into the internal magazine with a metallic click. He released the bolt. The rifle was ready. Total time to reload, perhaps 3 seconds. In the time it took a German rifleman to fire 1 shot and cycle his bolt for a second, Jensen had fired 8 shots and was ready to fire 8 more. This was the central promise of the M1 Garand, and it was a promise that seemed too good to be true when the rifle was first introduced. A semi-automatic rifle simple enough for conscript soldiers to maintain in field conditions, reliable enough to function in desert sand, jungle humidity, Arctic cold, and beach salt spray, powerful enough to remain effective at combat ranges beyond 300 yards, and fast enough to fundamentally change the nature of infantry firefights. But the path to that frozen Belgian ridgeline had been long and contentious. The rifle that Harold Jensen fired, with such casual effectiveness in December of 1944, had been called too complicated, too fragile, too expensive, and too radical by critics who believed the bolt-action rifle represented the pinnacle of military small arms design. The United States Army had nearly rejected it. Foreign observers had dismissed it as an expensive curiosity, unsuited for the realities of mass conscript warfare. Even some American soldiers trained on the bolt-action Springfield Model 1903 had viewed the new rifle with suspicion. The question that the M1 Garand posed was simple but profound. Could a semi-automatic rifle, self-loading and capable of rapid fire, actually be simpler and more effective than the bolt-action weapons that had dominated infantry combat since the late 1800s? The answer would emerge not from proving grounds or technical evaluations, but from the experiences of men like Jensen, who discovered in combat that sometimes the most revolutionary advancement comes not from adding complexity, but from removing the steps that slow a soldier down. To understand why the M1 Garand seemed so radical, you must first understand the world of military thinking that it entered. In the 1920s and early 1930s, every major military power equipped its infantry with bolt-action magazine-fed rifles. These weapons represented decades of refinement in firearms design. The British had their Lee Enfield. The Germans had developed the Mauser system. The Russians used the Mosin Nagant. The Japanese carried the Arisaka. And the United States issued the Springfield Model 1903. A rifle so well regarded that it remained in production and frontline service even after the M1 Garand was adopted. The bolt-action rifle was not a primitive weapon. It was, in many ways, the perfected expression of a particular philosophy of infantry combat. That philosophy held that rifle fire should be accurate, powerful, and delivered at ranges up to 1,000 yards or more. The individual rifleman was conceived as a marksman, a trained soldier who could estimate range, adjust his sights, account for wind and elevation, and place accurate fire on targets at distances that would seem remarkable to modern infantry armed with assault rifles optimized for engagements inside 300 yards. This doctrine had emerged from the experience of the First World War, where massed infantry attacks across open ground had been slaughtered by machine gun fire and artillery. Military theorists concluded that future infantry would need to engage at longer ranges using cover and concealment, relying on accurate rifle fire to suppress enemy positions before advancing. The bolt-action rifle, with its relatively long barrel, powerful cartridge, and emphasis on accuracy over rate of fire, fit this conception perfectly. The standard doctrine assumed that combat would unfold in a deliberate manner. Soldiers would take positions. They would identify targets. They would aim carefully and fire. They would work their bolt and fire again. The rate of fire was almost secondary to the accuracy and range of each individual shot. A good rifleman firing a bolt-action weapon could maintain effective fire indefinitely, pacing his shots, making each one count. This was the world into which John Cantius Garand introduced his self-loading rifle design. Garand was a Canadian-born engineer who had come to the United States and found work at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. He was quiet, methodical, and utterly consumed by the technical challenges of firearms design. In 1924, he began working on a semi-automatic rifle that would meet the United States Army's requirements for a self-loading weapon. The Army had been interested in semi-automatic rifles since before the First World War. Various designs had been tested, including weapons by John Pedersen and John Browning, but none had proven satisfactory. They were too heavy, too complicated, too prone to malfunction, or too expensive to manufacture in the quantities required to equip a mass army. The prevailing assumption among military procurement officers was that a truly reliable semi-automatic rifle might be theoretically possible, but practically unattainable with current technology and manufacturing capabilities. Garand approached the problem with an engineer's patience. His design used the expanding gases from the fired cartridge to cycle the action automatically, ejecting the spent case and loading a fresh round from the internal magazine. The rifle would fire every time the trigger was pulled until the magazine was empty. Then, when the last round was fired, the empty en-bloc clip would eject automatically with a distinctive metallic ping, and the bolt would lock open, ready for a fresh clip to be loaded. The simplicity of Garand's design was precisely what made it suspect to military conservatives. The rifle had fewer parts than many of the semi-automatic designs that had been rejected. It used a rotating bolt system that seemed almost too straightforward. The en-bloc clip, which held 8 rounds and was inserted as a complete unit into the rifle's magazine, eliminated the need for a detachable box magazine that could be lost or damaged. To Garand, this was elegant engineering. To his critics, it was suspiciously simple. Testing of early prototypes began in the late 1920s. The rifle showed promise, but it also revealed problems. Early versions experienced failures in extreme conditions. The gas system needed refinement. The clip loading mechanism jammed under certain circumstances. Each problem was addressed, each design flaw corrected, but the process took years. Years during which the critics argued that the entire concept was flawed, that the Army should stick with proven bolt-action technology, that the expense and complexity of fielding a semi-automatic rifle would never justify the marginal improvement in firepower. The debate was not merely technical, it was philosophical. Those who opposed the M1 Garand believed that rapid fire would encourage soldiers to waste ammunition. They argued that conscript armies needed simple weapons that could not malfunction, and that a bolt-action rifle was inherently more reliable because it had fewer moving parts and required manual operation by the soldier. They pointed to the fact that every successful army in the world used bolt-action rifles, and that this consensus represented accumulated wisdom that should not be casually discarded. They also worried about logistics. The M1 Garand fired the standard .30-06 cartridge, the same ammunition used in the Springfield rifle and the Browning automatic rifle. But a semi-automatic rifle would allow soldiers to fire much faster, which meant they would consume ammunition much faster. Could the supply system support this increased consumption? Would units run out of ammunition in the middle of battles? Would the rear echelon logistics network, designed around the slower firing rates of bolt-action weapons, collapse under the demand? In January of 1936, after more than a decade of development and testing, the United States Army officially adopted the M1 Garand as its standard service rifle. The designation was simple: United States Rifle, caliber .30, M1. But adoption was not the same as acceptance. Production began slowly at Springfield Armory. The rifles were expensive to manufacture, requiring precision machining and careful fitting of parts. Initial production runs revealed quality control problems. Some rifles worked flawlessly, others experienced stoppages and malfunctions. Foreign military observers who examined the M1 Garand were politely skeptical. The British tested it and decided to stick with their Lee Enfield. The French, who had experimented with their own semi-automatic designs, remained committed to bolt-action rifles. The Germans, who would later develop the Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifle, showed little interest in the American weapon. The consensus among European military professionals was that the M1 Garand was an interesting experiment, perhaps suitable for the wealthy Americans who could afford such luxuries, but not a practical weapon for serious military powers facing the realities of modern industrial warfare. Even among American soldiers, the initial reception was mixed. Men who had trained on the Springfield 1903, who had learned to shoot with bolt-action rifles since childhood, found the M1 Garand strange. It was heavier than the Springfield, weighing 9.5 pounds unloaded compared to the Springfield's 8.6 pounds. It was longer, measuring 43.6 inches overall. The semi-automatic action required the soldier to learn new habits, to trust the weapon to cycle itself, rather than manually working the bolt after each shot. The en-bloc clip system, which Garand had designed for simplicity and reliability, seemed awkward to men accustomed to loading individual rounds into a magazine or using stripper clips to charge a magazine from the top. The 8-round capacity was less than the 10 rounds carried in a Springfield magazine, though this was offset by the much faster reload time. And there was that distinctive ping when the empty clip ejected, a sound that some worried would alert enemy soldiers that the American rifleman was empty and vulnerable. The M1 Garand that entered production in 1936 was the result of methodical engineering rather than revolutionary inspiration. John Garand had stripped away everything that was not essential to the rifle's function. The operating system used a gas port drilled into the barrel approximately halfway down its length. When a cartridge fired, a small portion of the expanding propellant gases was diverted through this port into a gas cylinder positioned beneath the barrel. The gas pressure drove a piston rearward which rotated and unlocked the bolt, extracted and ejected the spent cartridge case, compressed the operating spring, and cocked the hammer. As the operating spring expanded again, it drove the bolt forward, stripping a fresh cartridge from the end block clip and chambering it. The bolt rotated into the locked position. The rifle was ready to fire again. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second and required no conscious action from the soldier beyond pulling the trigger. This was the simplicity that seemed too good to be true. Fewer than 70 parts in the entire rifle, compared to over 100 in some competing designs that had been rejected as too complex. The en-bloc clip that fed the rifle held 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. The clip itself was a stamped steel component weighing just over 1 ounce when empty. It cost approximately 2 cents to manufacture. A soldier could carry 10 clips in his standard ammunition belt, giving him 80 rounds of immediately available ammunition. Loading the clip into the rifle required a specific technique that became second nature with practice. The soldier pulled back the operating rod handle to lock the bolt to the rear. He inserted the loaded clip into the magazine from the top, pressing down firmly until it clicked into place. He released the bolt, which stripped the first round from the clip and chambered it. The rifle was loaded and ready. The safety mechanism was a rotating lever located inside the trigger guard, operated by the shooter's trigger finger. Push forward for safe, pull back for fire. It was intuitive and could be operated without looking, even with gloved hands in winter conditions. The sights consisted of a front blade protected by sturdy wings and a rear aperture adjustable for both windage and elevation. The aperture sight was faster to acquire than the notch-and-post sights used on most bolt-action rifles, allowing the shooter to align the sights and engage targets more quickly. Springfield Armory produced the first rifles at a rate of approximately 30 per day in early 1937. By 1940, production had increased to several hundred per day as manufacturing processes were refined and workers gained experience. The rifles required precision machining. The barrel was hammer forged and then rifled with 4 grooves in a right-hand twist, making one complete rotation in 10 inches of barrel length. The receiver was milled from a solid steel forging, a time-consuming process that ensured strength but limited production speed. Each rifle was hand-fitted and test-fired before acceptance. Armory workers gauged critical dimensions, checked head space to ensure the bolt locked properly, and function-tested every rifle through multiple firing cycles. Quality control was rigorous because the Army remembered the problems with early production runs. A rifle that malfunctioned in combat could cost a soldier's life, and Springfield Armory's reputation depended on delivering weapons that worked. The weight of 9.5 pounds was distributed well, with the rifle balancing naturally at the forward hand position. The walnut stock was designed to withstand rough handling, with metal reinforcements at stress points. The handguard above the barrel protected the shooter's hand from the heat of sustained firing while allowing air circulation to cool the barrel. The gas system was self-regulating, requiring no adjustment for different ammunition types or environmental conditions. It simply worked. Training soldiers to use the M1 Garand required overcoming decades of bolt-action muscle memory. Instructors at training camps across the United States developed standardized programs. Recruits learned to load the en-bloc clip, pushing down firmly on the top round with the thumb while avoiding getting the thumb caught when the bolt slammed forward, a painful mistake that became known as M1 thumb. They learned to fire from standing, kneeling, sitting, and prone positions. They learned to clear malfunctions, though these became increasingly rare, as manufacturing quality improved. Most importantly, they learned to trust the rifle's self-loading action. This was the fundamental psychological adjustment required. Men trained on bolt-action rifles had learned to pace their shots, working the bolt between each round, taking time to re-aim. The M1 Garand demanded a different rhythm. Aim, fire, let the rifle cycle. Re-aim, fire again. The trigger pull was consistent at approximately 4.5 pounds, light enough for accuracy but heavy enough to prevent accidental discharge. Soldiers learned to fire controlled pairs, 2 quick shots at a single target, or to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. By December of 1941, when the United States entered the Second World War, approximately 600,000 M1 Garand rifles had been produced. This was not nearly enough to equip the rapidly expanding American military. The Springfield rifle remained in service, particularly with rear echelon units and in training. But the Garand was the priority, and production accelerated dramatically. Winchester Repeating Arms Company began producing M1 rifles under contract in 1941. Harrington and Richardson Arms Company and International Harvester would follow. The first large-scale combat test of the M1 Garand came not in the European theater but in the Pacific, on a miserably hot island called Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on the island, beginning a campaign that would last 6 months and cost thousands of lives. The Marines carried M1 Garand rifles, though not every man had one. Some units still used the Springfield 1903, but enough Marines carried Garands that the Japanese soldiers defending the island would soon encounter something they had never experienced before. The Japanese Type 99 Arisaka rifle was a well-made bolt-action weapon firing a 7.7 millimeter cartridge. It was shorter and lighter than the M1 Garand, optimized for soldiers of smaller average stature. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized marksmanship and aggressive tactics. Their soldiers were trained to aim carefully and make each shot count. They were also trained in night attacks and close-quarters combat, where they believed their superior fighting spirit would overcome any American material advantages. The first significant infantry engagement occurred on August 21st, when a Japanese force of approximately 900 men attacked Marine positions along the Tenarue River. The attack came in the early morning darkness, with Japanese soldiers moving silently through the jungle before charging the Marine defensive line with rifles, machine guns, and bayonets. They expected to overwhelm the defenders through shock and aggression, tactics that had worked against Chinese forces and in earlier Pacific campaigns. What they encountered instead was a volume of rifle fire that seemed impossible. Marines in their foxholes and fighting positions fired their M1 Garands as fast as they could acquire targets and pull the trigger. 8 shots in rapid succession from each rifle, then a 3-second pause to reload, then 8 more shots. The distinctive crack of .30-06 rifles firing at maximum rate created a sound like continuous thunder. Japanese soldiers who had survived similar attacks against Chinese forces armed with bolt-action rifles could not comprehend what they were experiencing. A Japanese officer who survived the battle and was later captured described his confusion in interrogation. He had led men in combat for 3 years. He knew the rhythm of rifle fire, the pause between shots as soldiers worked their bolts, the brief opportunities those pauses created for his own men to advance or take cover. At the Tenarue River, there were no pauses. The American fire was continuous, relentless, overlapping as different Marines reloaded at different times. His men, advancing in the darkness, were cut down before they could close to effective rifle range. The battle lasted several hours and ended in a complete Japanese defeat. Over 800 Japanese soldiers were killed. Marine casualties were relatively light. The Marines credited their victory to superior positions, machine gun support, and artillery fire. But the infantry officers recognized something else. The M1 Garand had performed exactly as designed, giving individual riflemen a sustained rate of fire that had multiplied the effectiveness of their defensive line. Every Marine with a Garand had the firepower of 3 or 4 soldiers with bolt-action rifles. This pattern repeated across the Pacific Theater. On New Georgia in July of 1943, Army infantry armed with M1 Garands engaged Japanese positions in dense jungle. The rapid semi-automatic fire allowed American soldiers to suppress enemy positions while maneuvering, a tactic that was difficult with bolt-action rifles. On Tarawa, in November of 1943, Marines advancing across the island used their Garands to maintain fire superiority despite being outnumbered in some sectors. The ability to fire 8 aimed shots in the time a Japanese soldier fired 1 or 2 gave the Marines a critical advantage in the brutal close-range fighting. But it was in Europe, where the M1 Garand's superiority became undeniable, particularly when American infantry faced German soldiers armed with the Kar 98K. The German rifle was arguably the finest bolt-action infantry weapon ever made, a perfected design that was accurate, reliable, and well-suited to the German doctrine of combined arms warfare. German soldiers were well-trained and experienced. Many had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. They were not inferior troops armed with inferior weapons. They were among the best infantry in the world, and they discovered, engagement after engagement, that they could not match the sustained firepower of American riflemen. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In Normandy, in the hedgerow country of France, in June and July of 1944, American infantry fought German defenders in terrain that favored the defense. The bocage, as the French called it, was a landscape of small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows on earthen mounds. Visibility was limited to yards or tens of yards. Combat was sudden and close range. German soldiers with their Kar 98K rifles should have had every advantage, using cover and prepared positions to ambush advancing Americans. The mathematics of the firefight were simple and brutal. An experienced German soldier with a Kar 98K could fire approximately 15 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions. That assumed he was in a good position, not under significant stress, and had his ammunition readily accessible. In combat conditions, that rate typically dropped to 10 or 12 shots per minute. Each shot required him to pull back the bolt handle, which protruded at a right angle from the receiver, pull it fully rearward to extract the spent cartridge case and cock the firing pin, push it forward to chamber a fresh round from the 5-round internal magazine, and rotate it down to lock the bolt. This was a smooth motion when performed correctly, but it required time and diverted the shooter's attention from his target. An American soldier with an M1 Garand could fire 8 aimed shots in 10 seconds or less, reload in 3 seconds, fire 8 more shots. That was a sustainable rate of fire of approximately 48 aimed shots per minute, 4 times the rate of a bolt-action rifle. And this was not theoretical. This was the observed performance of average soldiers in combat conditions, men who had trained for months but were not exceptional marksmen, firing under stress with incoming fire and the chaos of battle around them. The tactical implications were profound. In a typical engagement between a squad of American infantry and a similar-sized German unit, the Americans could deliver approximately 4 times as many rounds downrange in the same period. This meant they could suppress enemy positions more effectively, keeping German soldiers pinned down and unable to return accurate fire. It meant they could engage multiple targets in rapid succession. It meant that even if individual German soldiers were better marksmen, which was often the case with veteran troops, they simply could not compete with the volume of fire coming from American positions. German soldiers began reporting to their officers that American infantry seemed to be equipped with automatic weapons across the entire line. They could hear the continuous rifle fire and assumed they were facing units with an unusually high proportion of machine guns or automatic rifles. When they discovered through captured weapons and interrogation of prisoners that the Americans were firing standard-issue semi-automatic rifles, the psychological impact was significant. The weapon they had dismissed as an expensive curiosity was proving to be a decisive tactical advantage. The Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 brought this reality into sharp focus. German forces launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. Initial attacks achieved surprise and drove American forces back. But as the battle developed into sustained infantry combat, the superiority of American small arms became increasingly apparent. German infantry, many of them young replacements with limited training, found themselves outgunned by American soldiers who might have had even less experience but who carried weapons that multiplied their effectiveness. Lieutenant Paul Bulge, commanding a rifle company in the 38th Infantry Regiment, described an engagement near Kalter-Herberg on December 17th. His company occupied defensive positions on a ridge line when German infantry attacked from the tree line 400 yards away. The Germans advanced in short rushes using cover effectively, their tactics disciplined and professional. Bulge's men, many of them replacements who had been with the unit for only a few weeks, held their fire until the Germans closed to within 200 yards. When Bulge gave the order to fire, his platoons opened up with their M1 Garands simultaneously. The volume of fire was, in his words, like nothing the Germans had encountered. The advancing infantry went to ground immediately, seeking any available cover. But the Americans kept firing, working through their en-bloc clips and reloading without pause. The distinctive ping of empty clips ejecting was lost in the general cacophony of rifle fire. Within minutes, the German attack stalled. Within 10 minutes, it broke. The survivors retreated to the tree line, leaving their dead and wounded in the open field. Bulge walked the line after the engagement, checking his men and assessing ammunition expenditure. Some soldiers had fired through 5 or 6 clips, 48 rounds, in the space of a few minutes. With bolt-action rifles, that volume of fire would have been impossible to sustain. The M1 Garand had allowed his inexperienced troops to defeat a well-executed attack by veteran German infantry simply by maintaining overwhelming fire superiority. The weapon had compensated for their lack of experience and given them confidence they otherwise would not have possessed. A captured German officer, interrogated after being wounded in a separate engagement in the Hürtgen forest, expressed frustration that bordered on disbelief. His men were trained soldiers. They knew their weapons. They used tactics that had proven effective on the Eastern Front. But they could not advance against American infantry because the volume of defensive fire was too great. He described watching his soldiers attempt to maneuver, trying to bound forward while others provided covering fire, only to be pinned down by what seemed like automatic weapons fire from every American position. When he learned that most of the fire came from semi-automatic rifles, standard issue to every American infantryman, he understood that his side was facing a fundamental material disadvantage that no amount of training or tactical skill could overcome. The M1 Garand's performance in combat silenced the remaining critics, who had argued for continued reliance on bolt-action rifles. Production accelerated throughout 1943 and 1944 as American industry fully mobilized. Springfield Armory, Winchester, Harrington and Richardson, and International Harvester collectively produced approximately 4 million M1 rifles between 1936 and 1945. The rifle became so thoroughly integrated into American infantry doctrine that by late 1944, essentially every frontline infantryman in both the European and Pacific theaters carried one. The soldiers who used the M1 Garand developed a relationship with the weapon that went beyond mere familiarity. It became an extension of their bodies, a tool they trusted absolutely. Veterans returning from Europe and the Pacific spoke of the rifle with a respect that bordered on affection. They had learned its quirks, the way it felt when properly maintained versus when it needed cleaning, the subtle changes in the sound of the action that indicated developing problems, the rhythm of combat that the rifle's semi-automatic action made possible. Harold Jensen, the Wisconsin farm boy who had fired his M1 on that frozen Belgian ridgeline in December of 1944, survived the Battle of the Bulge and continued fighting through the final months of the war in Europe. His rifle, serial number 3,412,863, stayed with him through the advance into Germany and across the Rhine. He cleaned it every day, sometimes twice a day in the wet spring weather. He replaced the stock once after it cracked during a fall. He fired thousands of rounds through it, each one ejecting cleanly, the action cycling smoothly, the rifle performing exactly as designed. When the war ended and Jensen returned home to Wisconsin in October of 1945, he was allowed to keep his rifle. Many veterans chose to retain their M1 Garands, paying a nominal fee to the government. Jensen kept his in the closet of his farmhouse for the rest of his life. He never fired it again after the war ended. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would take it out and work the action, feeling the familiar weight and balance, remembering the men he had served with and the weapon that had kept him alive. The German military's response to the M1 Garand was telling. By 1943, German ordnance departments were prioritizing development of semi-automatic rifles to counter the American advantage. The Gewehr 43, introduced that year, was a gas-operated semi-automatic rifle that showed clear influence from the American design philosophy. It was a capable weapon, well-made and effective. But it came too late and in too few numbers. Only approximately 400,000 G43 rifles were produced before the war ended, compared to 4 million M1 Garands. Most German infantry fought the entire war with bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, facing American soldiers who had firepower advantages that German tactics could not overcome. The Japanese never developed an effective semi-automatic rifle during the war. They experimented with various designs, including gas-operated and recoil-operated systems, but none entered production in significant numbers. Japanese infantry fought the entire Pacific War with bolt-action Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka rifles, weapons that were well made but fundamentally outclassed by American semi-automatic weapons. Japanese soldiers captured on Okinawa and other late-war battlefields consistently reported that American rifle fire was heavier and more sustained than they had been trained to expect. The Soviet Union, America's wartime ally, took careful note of the M1 Garand's performance. The Soviets had developed their own semi-automatic rifle, the Tokarev SVT-40, but it was complex, difficult to manufacture, and prone to malfunction in field conditions. Soviet production focused instead on submachine guns and bolt-action rifles. After the war, when the Soviet Union began developing its next generation of infantry weapons, they studied captured M1 Garands extensively. The influence can be seen in the SKS carbine and eventually in the development of the AK-47. Which incorporated lessons learned from the American emphasis on reliability and simplicity. British and Canadian forces, fighting alongside Americans in Europe, observed the M1 Garand's effectiveness with professional interest. British infantry still carried the Lee Enfield, an excellent bolt-action rifle that was actually faster to fire than the German Kar 98Ka due to its smooth bolt action and 10-round magazine. But it was still a bolt-action weapon, and British officers could see the tactical advantages the Americans enjoyed. After the war, Britain developed the EM2, a revolutionary bullpup rifle, but eventually adopted the FNFAL, a gas-operated semi-automatic design that owed much to the M1 Garand's proof of concept. General George S. Patton, never one for understated praise, called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. This was hyperbole, perhaps, but it reflected a genuine appreciation from a commander who understood infantry combat. Patton had seen his troops fight with the weapon across North Africa, Sicily, and Europe. He had observed how the rifle's sustained firepower allowed American infantry to overcome German defensive positions that should have been nearly impregnable. He recognized that the M1 Garand was not just a good rifle. It was a weapon that had fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of infantry warfare. The rifle's influence extended far beyond its immediate military applications. After the war, the M1 Garand became the foundation for American infantry weapons development for the next generation. The M14 rifle, adopted in 1957 as the M1 Garand's replacement, was essentially an updated version of the same basic design, modified to accept a detachable box magazine and fire the new 7.62 mm NATO cartridge. The operating system, the rotating bolt, the gas operation, all came directly from John Garand's original design. Even the M16 rifle, which replaced the M14 in the 1960s and represented a radical departure in caliber and appearance, owed a conceptual debt to the M1 Garand. The M16's designers understood that infantry rifles needed to be reliable, simple to maintain, and capable of sustained fire. These were the lessons that the M1 Garand had taught during the Second World War. The specific mechanisms changed. The caliber became smaller. The materials shifted from wood and steel to aluminum and plastic, but the fundamental philosophy remained the same. The M1 Garand served in American military hands long after the Second World War ended. It was the standard infantry rifle during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, where it again proved superior to the bolt-action rifles used by Chinese and North Korean forces. American soldiers fighting in the brutal cold of the Chosin Reservoir and in the hills around the Pusan perimeter relied on their M1 Garands exactly as their predecessors had in Europe and the Pacific. The rifle performed in temperatures that froze lubricants and made other weapons unreliable. Soldiers learned to clean their rifles obsessively and keep them dry, and in return the rifles kept firing. Even after the M14 was adopted, M1 Garands remained in service with Reserve and National Guard units well into the 1960s. Some rifles saw service in the early years of American involvement in Vietnam. The last M1 Garands were finally retired from frontline American military service in the 1970s, nearly 40 years after the rifle was first adopted. This longevity testified to the soundness of the original design. The rifle that critics had called too complex and too expensive had proven to be remarkably durable and adaptable. John Cantius Garand, the engineer whose patient work had created this weapon, received remarkably little financial compensation for his innovation. As a government employee working at Springfield Armory, his designs belonged to the United States government. He received his salary and eventually a government pension. He never received royalties on the millions of rifles that bore his name. In 1944, Congress awarded him $75,000 in recognition of his contributions, a sum that was generous by government standards but modest compared to the value his design had provided. Garand accepted this with characteristic quietness. He had not designed the rifle for financial reward. He had designed it to work. Garand continued working at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953. He lived quietly in Massachusetts, occasionally consulting on firearms projects, attending veterans' gatherings where soldiers thanked him personally for creating the weapon that had kept them alive. He died in 1974 at the age of 86, having lived long enough to see his rifle become one of the most recognized and respected military weapons in history. His obituary in the New York Times was brief, noting his work on the M1 rifle and his long service at Springfield Armory. It did not capture the magnitude of his contribution or the number of lives his design had saved. The rifles themselves, 4 million of them produced during the war years, had varied fates. Some were destroyed in combat, damaged beyond repair, and abandoned on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific. Some were captured by enemy forces and studied, reverse-engineered, copied. Many were sold as military surplus after the war, finding their way into the hands of civilian shooters and collectors who appreciated the rifle's quality and historical significance. Hundreds of thousands went into long-term storage in government arsenals, maintained in Cosmoline and awaiting potential future conflicts. The story of the M1 Garand is not a story of technological revolution. It is a story of evolutionary refinement and of challenging institutional resistance to change. The rifle did not introduce radically new concepts. Semi-automatic firearms had existed since the late 19th century. Gas operation was well understood. The idea of a self-loading rifle was not revolutionary. What was revolutionary was the execution, the patient engineering work that created a semi-automatic rifle, simple enough and reliable enough to become a standard infantry weapon issued to conscript soldiers. The critics who had called the M1 Garand too complex had been wrong, but their concerns had not been entirely unreasonable. Previous semi-automatic rifle designs had been complex. They had been unreliable. They had required more maintenance than bolt-action rifles, and had been prone to malfunction in field conditions. The skepticism was based on experience with inferior designs. What the critics had failed to anticipate was that an engineer with sufficient patience and skill could solve these problems, could create a semi-automatic rifle that was actually simpler in practical use than a bolt-action weapon. Because that was the ultimate irony of the M1 Garand. It was simpler than a bolt-action rifle, not in terms of mechanical complexity, but in terms of the soldier's experience. The soldier did not need to remember to work the bolt. He did not need to maintain the rhythm of manual cycling. He aimed and fired, and the rifle did the rest. This reduction in cognitive load, this elimination of one step in the firing sequence, made the weapon more intuitive and easier to use under stress. Soldiers could focus on target acquisition and tactical awareness rather than on operating their weapon. The battlefield evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. From Guadalcanal to the Bulge to Okinawa, American infantry with M1 Garands had consistently outfought enemy infantry armed with bolt-action rifles. This was not because American soldiers were better trained or more courageous. Often they were less experienced than their opponents, particularly in the European theater, where they faced German veterans who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front. The advantage was material. The rifle allowed average soldiers to perform at levels that would have required exceptional soldiers with bolt-action weapons. The Germans had recognized this by 1943. Their development of the G43 semi-automatic rifle and their later work on the Sturmgewehr assault rifle reflected an understanding that the future of infantry weapons lay in self-loading designs. But recognition came too late. German industry, strained by the demands of total war and targeted by Allied bombing, could not produce enough semi-automatic rifles to make a difference. The Wehrmacht fought most of the war with weapons that were, by 1944, a generation behind American infantry arms. The Japanese never reached this recognition. Their military culture, which emphasized fighting spirit and individual warrior skill, resisted the idea that weapons technology could be decisive. Japanese soldiers were taught that superior morale and training would overcome material disadvantages. The M1 Garand proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. No amount of fighting spirit could compensate for being able to fire one shot while your opponent fired 8. For the soldiers who carried M1 Garands, the weapon became inseparable from their war experience. It was the tool that allowed them to survive, to fight effectively, to have confidence in engagements where they might otherwise have been overwhelmed. The rifle's reliability meant they could trust it absolutely. The semi-automatic action meant they could maintain fire when they needed it most. The en-bloc clip system, once considered a weakness, proved to be fast and intuitive, allowing reloads that were quicker than fumbling with stripper clips or loose rounds. And there was something else, something harder to quantify but real nonetheless. The M1 Garand gave American soldiers a psychological advantage. They knew they had better weapons than their enemies. They knew that in a straight firefight, rifle against rifle, they had superior firepower. This knowledge bred confidence, and confidence in combat is a force multiplier as significant as any technical specification. Soldiers who believe they have the better weapon fight more aggressively, take more calculated risks, press advantages more readily. The rifle that had been dismissed as too simple, too expensive, too radical, had proven to be exactly what was needed. It was simple in the ways that mattered, eliminating unnecessary complexity and focusing on reliability and ease of use. It was expensive, certainly, costing approximately $85 per rifle to manufacture compared to $30 for a Springfield bolt action. But that cost was justified by the tactical advantages it provided, and it was radical, representing a fundamental shift in infantry weapons philosophy. But that radicalism was grounded in sound engineering and validated by combat experience. John Garand's patient work, spread across more than a decade of design, refinement, and testing, had created something rare in military history, a weapon that was genuinely transformative. Not because it was the most powerful, or the most accurate, or the most technologically advanced, but because it was reliable, simple to use, and well suited to the realities of modern infantry combat. It gave average soldiers, conscripts with months rather than years of training, the firepower to compete with and defeat veteran troops armed with excellent but outdated weapons. The lesson of the M1 Garand extended beyond small arms design. It demonstrated that sometimes the most important innovations come not from adding features but from removing obstacles. The rifle's semi-automatic action did not give soldiers a new capability. Soldiers with bolt-action rifles could fire multiple shots. What it did was remove the pause between shots, the moment of vulnerability when the soldier's attention shifted from the target to the weapon. That elimination of a single step, that smoothing of the firing sequence, multiplied effectiveness in ways that purely technical analysis had failed to predict. When Harold Jensen stood on that Belgian ridgeline in December of 1944 and fired 8 shots in rapid succession while German soldiers struggled to work their bolts and return fire, he was experiencing the culmination of decades of engineering work and institutional debate. He probably did not think about John Garand or Springfield Armory or the critics who had tried to block the rifle's adoption. He thought about the targets in front of him and the men depending on him and staying alive to see another day. But the weapon in his hands represented a quiet revolution in military technology, a revolution built not on complexity, but on elegant simplicity. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.